Hello everyone, thanks so much for joining us this evening for tonight's digital rally against police brutality to kick off the Labour Against Racism and Fascism and Socialists of Colour Summer Conference on State Violence. My name is Hajera Begum and I am the Member of Parliament for Poplar and Limehouse and a proud member of Labour Against Racism and Fascism Steering Committee, and I'm going to be chairing this evening's session. Now, to begin with, the injustice of George Floyd's death has angered many young Black and Asian people across the globe, and that was no different to us here in the UK. Young people took to the streets to demand long overdue changes in, and for some, the complete dismantling of the current capitalist system. Many, as we know, are still under the impression that compared to the US, the UK is much better off, that we are somehow policed by consent, and that the defunding of the police in the UK is nonsense. But the UK is no panacea, and systemic racism is rife. We know about Sean Grigg, who died being beaten by police in 2008, Olaseni Lewis, who died from police restraint in 2010, Kingsley Burrell, who died in police custody in 2011, Sarah Reid, who died in police custody in 2016, Rashan Charles, who died in 2017 after being arrested by the police. Prevent is forced upon us in our education system, and Black and Asian people are more likely to be suffering from inequality. Now, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers here with us today: Zehrah Hasan, Maurice McLeod, Bianca Cunningham, Deej Malik-Johnson, Ribeiro-Addy, Asad Rehman, Hajera Begum, and Imani Robinson. Unfortunately, Kehinde Andrews isn't able to make the session this evening, but we hope that you'll find the session informative, inspiring, and enlightening. So first, I'd like to introduce Zehrah Hasan. Zehrah is a pupil barrister at the Garden Court Chambers. Her legal practice centres around migrant rights, racial justice, state accountability, trans and queer liberation, and gender equality. Zehrah is also the Equality and Diversity Officer for Legal Sector Workers United and a founding member of Black Protest Legal Support. She has previously worked for non-profit organisations including Liberty and Southall Black Sisters. Zehrah will kick us off to talk about policing the borders. So over to you, Zehrah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Apsana. And thank you so much for inviting me to join you all today. It's a real privilege to share virtual space with such amazing panelists. As Apsana said, I'm going to speak briefly about policing the borders. Police racism within the immigration context, in my view, is perhaps one of the most brutal tools of the state. And in a climate where anti-migrant rhetoric is rife, it's also one of the least challenged. We need to remember that migrants, particularly Black and brown migrants, are subject to multiple levels of discrimination by the police. Not only, as we all well know, are the police institutionally racist in the UK, but the immigration system is also inherently racist. It's a system that has been born out of an artificial construction of borders and controls, and it enjoys its own colonial amnesia. So when we combine the two, what we have are some of the most oppressive forms of state violence in the UK. Now, as was mentioned, I'm a pupil barrister, but for myself and other immigration lawyers, whilst it's important that we do the work that we do and challenge the racist border in the courts, our work does also mean a level of complicity. We have to work within an unjust system, and we have to attempt to dismantle it slowly from the inside. And as Audre Lorde says, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So for me, that's why for any anti-racist activist, abolition must be a key and guiding principle that always remains the ultimate goal. So there's a huge amount that I could cover in the area of policing the borders, from immigration raids, mass deportation, detention. but to really demonstrate the cruel interaction between policing and the immigration system in the UK, I want to use the hostile environment as an example. And I'm sure everyone is aware the hostile environment policy came into place in 2010 and marked a new wave of attacks on migrants in the UK by preventing people from accessing basic services, including housing, healthcare, education, and social welfare. And what we have seen as part of the hostile environment is an increasingly close relationship between immigration control and policing. And this is particularly evident when it comes to examining the experiences of migrant survivors of domestic abuse, something that I've worked on a lot in both legal and policy contexts. Inevitably, domestic abuse survivors who have insecure immigration status are more vulnerable to domestic abuse and are also less likely to access the necessary support and advocacy they need. And when survivors do turn to the police, they're often met with hostility and a culture of disbelief. And I think this is well demonstrated by a case which was documented by Southall Black Sisters. A woman's husband threatened to kill and attempted to strangle her. He then left her stranded. She was supported by Southall Black Sisters to report her experience to the police, but instead of investigating her report, they appeared to be more interested in her immigration status. They asked her questions about her immigration status, causing her to panic and become distressed. Her domestic abuse advocate had to remind the officer that their priority was to assist her as a domestic violence victim and not to police her immigration status. And they took no further action against the perpetrator. Now, someone who believes in police reform might say that to resolve this situation, the police need better training and they need to do their jobs better. Now, what I say as someone who is an abolitionist is that this type of interaction is reflective of the broader problem and not something that can be meaningfully fixed by way of reform. And I say this because in an immigration system whose very foundation is racist and oppressive, and a policing system that is also inherently racist and oppressive, immigration control will always come first. And in fact, policing in this context is a tool for exploitation. So again, thinking about the experiences of migrant survivors of domestic abuse, we know, for instance, that as part of the hostile environment, there have been data sharing agreements between public bodies and the Home Office, including the police. Now, referrals from the police to the Home Office for immigration enforcement purposes rose from 634 in 2014 to 3,372 in 2015. And we know that those referrals include migrant victims of crime who report to the police and then find themselves detained or deported. In one case in 2017, a woman who reported being kidnapped and sexually abused was arrested on immigration charges whilst she was being cared for in a centre for sexual assault victims. And she was also 5 months pregnant at the time. And in fact, it has been established that the police think of migrants in these positions of vulnerability as low-hanging fruit. So they think that by waiting for these people to report crimes and then referring them to the Home Office for immigration enforcement, it's an easy way to boost and meet referral and deportation targets which have been set by the Home Office. Now, similarly, migrants have a whole host of increasingly complex and difficult to navigate immigration laws, and coupled with those, immigration offences. And as made clear by my previous example, the police are very keen to enforce and arrest people for committing so-called immigration offences. And those offences include things such as illegal entry, carrying false documents, breaching a condition of leave, deception. And there's even an immigration offence which is facilitating the arrival of an asylum seeker. And all of these offences, so-called offences, could result in lengthy prison sentences. So with this context, people end up trapped in the system. They're unable to enter the country or obtain a secure status because of these very restrictive and complex immigration laws. They're then arrested for an immigration offence, and then they're faced with detention and deportation. So to those who say to abolitionists, but the police protect us, I really want people to consider and reflect, what do you mean by us? Because it's certainly not migrants. We know from the conversations around police brutality in the UK, it's not Black and brown people. And it's not those who desperately seek protection. So in my view, we have to dismantle this notion of the police as protectors that pervades mainstream discourse, and recognise that the police are fundamentally agents of power who leverage racism against us all. And they do so particularly sharply in the immigration context by exploiting vulnerability and instability. So just to sum up, in my view, whilst borders exist, the police will enforce them. They'll enforce them in our schools, in our hospitals, in our homes, and on the streets. So when we say no police, we must also say in the same breath, no borders. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Zehrah. I know you have to leave at 10 minutes past, so just very quickly, I mean, thank you so much for your contribution. And just to really pick up, I mean, you mentioned your work with Southall Black Sisters and domestic abuse. I mean, why do you think that there is such an affront to such a views against sort of police being defunded or police being abolished, the idea being so, seen to be so radical? Where do you think that really comes from, and who do you think, really purports those kind of views in UK society?
Yeah, I do think that it does come back to this notion that I mentioned about the police as protectors. And I think there is, even for people who are perhaps leaning towards the idea or more progressive, they still fundamentally believe that we need police to protect society. And I think the real issue, and from my experience of working with some of the most vulnerable people in society in the immigration context, but also in the criminal justice system and other contexts, and particularly people with very severe mental health conditions, which I think will be explored later, it's actually the police who tend to exacerbate people's problems, or who can exploit vulnerability for other ends, for instance, in the immigration context. So I think there is an idea that the police are necessary to maintain kind of social order. And I think what I really want to highlight through the work that I've done, and I'm sure all of the other speakers have done, is that that's not true. So we need to kind of dispel that myth in order to get people to understand why defunding is an important model.
Thank you so much. Just to remind those that are watching, you can submit questions through the Facebook comments section. And we do have a question that's come in from Chloe, which sort of touches upon what you just sort of mentioned about immigration. And just to sort of say, I mean, the sort of examples that you've given are actually real kind of examples of ones that even I deal with, and I know Belle and others sort of deal with as members of Parliament. It's very much a live issue. And our casework really does represent these sorts of issues. And I imagine it is actually the case across the country. So the question from Chloe is, what's the best way, do you think, to reframe the debate around migration? And how do we challenge that right-wing framing? What are the ways in which we can challenge that?
I think that is really, really difficult. And I think in the current climate, it can be quite disheartening to have those conversations with people who are of that mindset. But I think ultimately it all boils down to kind of basic humanity and basic dignity. And the people that I work with, my clients, are from a range of circumstances, and we don't want to kind of create this good migrant, bad migrant distinction. Everyone is an individual, everyone has their own life experiences, and often those life experiences are rooted in some sort of social inequality or political unrest, which will lead them to the situation that they're in. And it's about engaging people in understanding the very human stories behind the people that, for instance, I work with. And that's sort of what I do. I sort of try and bring my experience to the table and say, well, you know, these are real people, this is what they're dealing with, and there's always going to be some sort of relatability to everyone's lives. And for me, that's been the most effective way to kind of engage with people who are perhaps on the really other end of the political spectrum to myself. But systemically, I think it's really about combining a mixture of kind of political, legal, and grassroots challenging to kind of oppressive immigration policies and laws. And I think we have to work together in order to achieve that. We can't do it alone. It won't happen just in Parliament, it won't happen just in courts, and it won't happen just on the streets. It has to be a combination of all three, in my view.
Thank you so much. And just sort of to touch upon, I mean, your work in the legal sector, how are things there in terms of really trying to, you know, work on migrant rights, racial justice and state accountability? Where do you think the challenges are there, and what could, you know, the layperson who isn't really involved in the legal sector, what could they do to sort of understand what the challenges are in that sector overall?
I think the challenges in the legal sector are often reflective of the kind of broader issues of racism in society. So what we face sometimes, particularly in the immigration context, are prejudicial judges. And that is, a lot of that is systemically because the legal sector is also not a diverse place and has its own inequalities. So that's one aspect of it that needs to be looked at. But in terms of the sort of more strategic things that are going on, I think for people who are interested, there is so much amazing kind of real kind of legal activism work that's going on to make sure that there are systemic challenges. So lots of lawyers will be always bringing strategic litigation, which are kind of public law challenges against immigration policies or laws or practices. And some of those challenges that have NGO involvement will always need financial support or support to kind of raise awareness about a particular case or campaign that goes alongside it. So I think to kind of be engaged with those things and with all the kind of big migrants' rights charities is a way to sort of support that work and help kind of affect that change.
I was just looking earlier today on what's really being said about sort of women in prisons and the representation of women and Black women in prisons, and whether there really needs to be, you know, a serious kind of discussion in this country about women offenders, for example, non-violent offences, criminal offences nonetheless, but non-violent ones, and how you know, they can be sort of accommodated back into society. And right now, I mean, the lens in which they're viewed is, you know, obviously as criminals, but in a very sort of difficult kind of way, where they come out and they don't have much support or access to be accommodated back into society. And I mean, there really needs to be a review in the way in which these women are looked at through the system, and really look at the underlying maybe reasons as to why you know, they end up in prison or commit those non-violent offences. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So 56% of women in prison are survivors of domestic abuse. So there is a real there's a real connection between women who've experienced exploitation or abuse and offending. So I absolutely think that that is something that does need to be addressed, and lots of women's rights organisations are doing some really good work around that. But obviously, I think it does fall into this broader picture of what are the purpose of prisons, and I'm sure that will kind of be discussed later, but looking from an abolitionist perspective as well, I think it's about not just making things kind of better in the short term, but thinking what are the kind of injustices that we need to solve now, and what's the broader injustice that we need to kind of solve altogether. So yeah, but I think that issue definitely does need to be addressed.
Thank you so much, Zehrah, for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing more of the work that you do and hearing from you as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So next we'll hear from Bianca Cunningham. Bianca Cunningham is a former Verizon wireless worker who led co-workers in 7 stores across Brooklyn, New York to join CWA, the American Communications Union, in 2014, making them the first unionized retail workers in the company. She later led her co-workers on a 49-day strike to secure their first contract. Verizon fired her for organizing, and during the Verizon strike, picketers across the country chanted, "Bring back Bianca." Bianca was on the bargaining team to help secure their first contract for stores in Brooklyn, as well as a store in Massachusetts that followed suit in unionizing. She then went on to train members how to organize non-union workers in their industry. Bianca co-founded DSA's Afro Socialists and Socialists of Color Caucus, a caucus for Black, Indigenous, and people of color within the organization. She also served as co-chair of the NYC chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America for 2 terms. She is now on the staff at Labor Notes, where she facilitates training on race, economic inequality, and workplace organizing. So welcome, Bianca, and it'd be great to hear from you today.
Hi, and thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with all of you. I just want to say thank you to Labor Against Racism and Fascism, as well as thank you to Socialists of Color. This is really exciting. So I only have 5 minutes and I have a lot to say. So I'll try to, I'm going to talk fast and try to get it all in. Yeah, as you mentioned, my background is labor organizing. I first came into, I had no idea about unions when I started to organize in my workplace, but my introduction into the movement was through the union organizer that I was working with, took me to a rally, a Black Lives Matter rally for Eric Garner because he had been murdered that summer that we were organizing, and like kind of the rest is history. I've just been involved since then. I just want to say that because I say that there's like a huge link between labor and Black Lives Matter and labor and the movement to end white supremacy, and I feel like labor does have a role to play. And so yeah, getting people involved in the way that I got involved and understanding the connections between all these struggles is super important. I got involved in the Black Lives Matter movement at that time, as I mentioned, when Eric Garner was being murdered. I'm based out of Brooklyn, New York, from New York City. And I remember I just want to talk about a little bit about the US and the context to which we like approach this question of the world without police. And so in the 60s and 70s, of course, it becomes popular with the Black Panther Party talking about policing the pigs. And what community control over police looks like. And then the argument kind of develops into like, well, should we forget control over the police? We shouldn't have them at all. 20 years ago, Critical Resistance was formed, which is a kind of like the mother of the prison abolition movement in this country. And then you start to see works from Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, et cetera, on this very topic. At the time where I got involved in the first iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement, I remember hearing a lot about reforms. We just need police reforms. We need the police to look like people who come from our communities. In New York City, for instance, over 60% of the police force don't actually live within the confines of New York City proper. They actually live in the suburbs way out. And so there's all these things about how we just need to get more people who look like us, Black and brown officers. Well, that myth was debunked with Freddie Gray, when we see that 3 of the officers that actually murdered him were Black, and that this is not a question of individual attitudes or even racist attitudes. This is really a system that's designed to operate in the way that it has been and will continue until we end it. And so that debunked that myth. Then we started to hear about body cameras. We just need body cameras and to mandate that, and that will fix the behavior. Well, we see right now, 5 years later, body cameras don't do anything. Half the time they're not even on or working, and there's no consequences for not using the body cameras, and it obviously has not stopped any of the brutality or harm that the state has enacted against communities. I just want to talk a little bit more about the even stuff that I worked on as like a baby socialist. I worked on something called the Right to Know Act, which is a police reform that was going to say the police have to give you a business card with their badge number and their precinct and the information to make a complaint if you feel like they have abused their power with you, you have the right to refuse searches, for instance. We passed this legislation after years and years of coalition building, getting the community on our side. We passed the laws into existence. and the police department has no obligation to follow, to change the handbook, to change the guidelines. And so then our job as a coalition turns into chasing them to make sure that they actually enacting the new protocol and the laws that were passed. And not only that, but also spending a lot of time trying to re-educate citizens on what the new laws mean. This is not like like reforms don't work. This is not a sustainable model. If we have to wait 5 to 6 years to get these very small reforms that just move the dial a bit, I think that we're in real trouble. And so I learned from passing that own piece of legislation that it doesn't matter. It's not about the law. We just need to take power and money away from the police departments themselves. I'll also just say too, another thing that people would say is a win in this, the climate of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, this recent uprising is that, we had a bill to fight to get records released on police officers to say, if you had like a troubled checkered record as far as your policing behavior, that would be open to the public and the public can access those records and see who the supposed rotten apples are. Well, we got that passed, right? And yay, we all celebrate and say that was a win. And now the police department is suing us and saying that it's illegal and that they don't want to revert. They don't think that they should have to release those records to the public. And so we see that even in stop and frisk state, we went all the way up to the Supreme Court and it still happens. These reforms, they're not effective. And I think that we're in a place in this country where we're kind of past what these small reforms might look like and what their potential is. So we moved on to the call of defund the police. And that just means taking money and power away from police departments and transferring them to things that actually make our community safe, like community service, health care, housing, mental health care as well. But I want to talk a little bit about what it's going to take. So I think that defund the police is the first step to abolition, or a good step to abolition, right? Because it starts to diminish the power of the police departments themselves, but it is just a first step. The goal is to abolish the police. But when we say abolish the police, I feel like so many times, even those of us who really believe in the practice don't actually understand the gravity of what we're saying. And so I think that it's because we don't talk about the other things that need to happen along with defunding and abolishing the police. And I just want to talk about a couple of them. Number one, we need to have a cultural shift. I remember having a conversation with one of my trans women's friends the other day, and she was like, yeah, I'm an abolitionist, but I'm not fighting to defund the police in a world where I'm just gonna get my ass kicked in the street because people have, transphobic and homophobic views about my lifestyle. And so I really do think what we need a cultural shift. Even in harm-free zones that we've seen in the United States, I participated in organizing one of the autonomous zones this summer in New York City, Occupy City Hall. What we saw there was that thousands of people came to a space to say that they wanted to defund the police, to stand with the Black Lives Matter movement. And because they were upset about the response of COVID and the ways that systematic injustice have just ran through our community in the last year, they still didn't prescribe to real abolitionist practices because they were still demonizing trans people in this space. They were still yelling down Black women in this space and calling them outside of their name. They were still being misogynistic and harmful in their behavior. And so it really took us to really buckle down and say, okay, we're all here because we say that we keep us safe, but what does it really mean that we keep one another safe? And that means that we have to be accountable for the ways in which we inflict harm on one another. And so I feel like those kinds of shifts, that shift happened in that space. It took about a month to get people to that place, to understand that yes, there will be people in the space who will harm others. We had that happen. We had people who mentally, need services and were harmful and violent towards others. And what does that look like to address that harm without violence? People's instincts is to just beat the guy up. And then we have to talk about why you shouldn't be beating this guy up. Why actually we need to be, addressing this in restorative justice circles and healing justice circles and transformative justice circles, focusing on the person who actually had the harm done to them and not focusing so much on the carceral punishment or the punitiveness of, this individual's behavior. I want to share a personal, and so I'll say that, yeah, we need to do a culture shift. And that comes from media. I think media really perpetuates this fear that we have of one another. because of our differences, but even one another in our sameness. Just anybody who is not in our, what they've prescribed as like the Western nuclear family, we're taught to fear. And we get those ideas reinforced through music, through media, etc. And so I think that we just really need to seriously think about what it looks like to have a culture shift. And the second thing is like, we need to be building infrastructure that can replace the police in the meantime, community infrastructure. We've seen some examples of this in the United States, but not nearly enough. People having, harm-free zones is one example, autonomous zones where the police are not welcome, and that people use community policing or community collectivity as a way to hold people accountable for behavior. We've seen sobriety centers, we've seen universal basic income, but we haven't seen it near to the scale that we need to have those things in place in order to really talk about what it looks like to transition from a carceral state and a police state. I just want to share one of my personal, because the question was, what would the world look like without police? I actually have two instances that really stick out in my mind personally that I experienced. Number one, I got my house broken into 4 in the morning. I was coming home from work. At the time I was a sex worker, coming home from work at 4 in the morning for my shift, and there was a young white gentleman in my apartment waiting for me. I did not know this person. I was with somebody. We wrestled this individual to the ground. And then once we realized that we were actually having like a real struggle with this person, I ended up calling 911. The police came with their guns drawn on this individual. I turn around and my friend is gone. Well, he's gone because he's undocumented from West Africa. And, even he should have been deemed a hero in that moment for potentially saving my life, but instead was running for his own life. I think that would definitely be different in a world without police. I also want to say the next day when I went to get to do the statement and to talk to the police about what happened, and this is maybe 10 years ago, they said that the individual, had mental health issues and that they had been off their meds and that they had admitted to stalking me for 4 months, watching my comings and goings, etc. The person got sentenced to 6 months in jail. Well, that didn't address any of the harm that personally I felt. I felt unsafe still, right? The police coming didn't make me feel safer in my apartment. I had really big issues re-entering my apartment. I lived alone at the time. So it didn't address any of the harm that I had. It didn't that was inflicted upon me. Also didn't address the harm or the situation with the young man. The young man obviously needed services, was off of his meds, needed something different. It wasn't jail for 6 months, and I'm sure it could come out and the same thing can happen again. And just to give an anecdote, like 2 months later, I did have, a peeping Tom at my door, that I had gotten a dog chased away. And so the police coming didn't make me any safer, didn't make the neighborhood any safer, didn't stop individuals from trying to harm, so the police just don't keep us safe. Another example is 2 years ago, my upstairs neighbor who is bipolar, been living in this neighborhood for 34 years. He lived upstairs with his family. Everybody knows him, very sweet, the kind of person that goes to get groceries for elders, gives kids quarters, etc., but does struggle, with something. And so some days you walk down the street and you see they're having a bad day and it's okay. And nobody feels unsafe because we all understand, we know each other, and we've collectively made a decision that we are going to hold space for this person and whatever they're dealing with without calling the police. As our neighborhood became gentrified, 2 years ago, he was having a similar episode, never has harmed anybody, never has hurt anybody. And somebody called the police and the police came. They thought he had a gun and they did a drive-by shooting on him at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in front of a bus stop where kids were getting off the bus and knew him coming from schools. They handcuffed his body and threw him in the back of a van. That does not make me feel safe. My community was completely traumatized and torn apart. He was very well known in our community and very well loved, as I mentioned. And so there was not, in this current system that we have, there was no resources or anything given to us as a community to deal with that trauma, to deal with that pain, to deal with the loss. It certainly didn't help Saheed, who's my neighbor who was murdered. It didn't help his family, and they shouldn't have been the people who are called for mental health, for a mental health emergency in the very first place. And so, a world without police, my neighbor would be alive, and we wouldn't be traumatized as a community. And just to go back a little bit deeper on that one, Saheed's best friend was killed by the police when he was 15, and the doctors and his family believes that that's where kind of the pivot, that's where his behavior type kind of pivoted, and he got diagnosed with, you know, this mental health disorder or mental health issue of bipolar disorder as a result of the trauma that was inflicted on him by seeing his best friend get murdered by the police. So this is just a vicious cycle that continues to claim the lives of Black, brown, poor people all over the world. And what we're trying to envision is a world that we don't fear one another, where we actually have infrastructure in place to have collective care and to address harm and healing. I think that this country probably doesn't even know what healing is, because we're always trying to put Band-Aids on things through consumerism and other ways. And so I just feel like, yeah, we're trying to transition to a place, and I think that it's very in line. And so there's a lot of socialists in the United States who don't believe, you know, that this is a socialist demand, who don't believe that we should be putting resources towards defund. And I just want to say that I believe that it's compatible with the kind of democracy, radical democracy, that we'd like to see. Community control and collective accountability goes hand in hand with a community type of infrastructure that we're trying to build to replace all of the oppressive systems and institutions in our lives and really take power back from the ruling class. So I just want to thank you all for having me, and that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Bianca. I mean, that was so insightful, but also, you know, just to hear from you in terms of your personal sort of testimony as well, you know, quite harrowing, but at the same time, quite powerful as well. I also was kind of just thinking about what you said a bit earlier on, and it kind of resonated with me in terms of my role as a London-based MP. You sort of talked about, you know, police being maybe outside of the city and sort of, you know, working in the city. And one of the things that I find as well, I mean, for example, the Metropolitan Police here in London, you know, a lot of the police officers are recruited from outside of London, and the diversity of the communities in London in urban areas and the challenges of that sometimes are not sort of taken into account, and you sort of do wonder, you know, what happens with the sort of training that does occur as well. We've had lots of questions come in through Facebook. So I'll start with the first one, which is, with one city voting to disband the police, do you think that they will follow through, and how quickly do you think other cities will pick this up?
You already see them walking back in Minneapolis, where they voted to disband the police, and they're already trying to walk that back. And so I think that, like, just as, I mean, it's no different from how we have to fight, you know, years for these small reforms that, you know, feel kind of like insignificant, but the fact that we have to fight for years for that, I think that, you know, that's just setting us up for the idea that if you're talking about disbanding the police department, it's going to be a huge fight. I don't know. I think that it will be co-opted by neoliberals and by, you know, others. You know, we saw that happen in Camden, where in Camden, New Jersey, in the United States, you know, when all of this was happening about will Minneapolis disband, they wanted to lift this up in the media as an example of a time where the police department was disbanded. Well, the police department was disbanded in Camden because they were having budget issues, not because they were trying to address any, you know, public safety issue. And what actually happened is that they went ahead and rebuilt it without any community input. And that police department is just as harmful, just as violent, and just as brutal as the police department that it replaced. And so I want to be really careful and mindful about how, you know, these efforts get co-opted very quickly by other interests. And so I hope for the best, but I think that we really have a huge fight on our hands.
Do you think it will be rolled back? Do you think there's more of a likelihood that it will get rolled back?
Yeah, I don't, as far as the, are you talking about the promise to disband the police in and of itself? Will it be rolled back?
Well, the example of one sort of area sort of doing this and sort of trying to make this step, which, you know, in some ways seems small, but in some ways is quite big, to vote to disband the police. Do you think, you know, this will actually result in meaningful change? Do you think that, you know, actually it's going to get rolled back? This is not actually going to happen?
I think if they involve coalition partners and actually the community in the decision, that it will happen. And I think that if they choose to decide that they know the best way to move forward, then we already know that the ruling class is in their ear and trying to figure out a way to turn a profit off of things like this. And so it really does depend on who's a part of the process, I think, how it will go.
Thank you. I've got a question from Akbar, and Akbar is sort of asking, how do we deal with violent emergencies such as armed robberies that communities might be nervous to tackle? And I know you sort of mentioned sort of about collective trauma and collective sort of healing as well, but something like armed robberies, something that's quite violent and it's an emergency in a lot of ways, and communities may be nervous to really take that on head on. What do you think we can do to deal with instances and cases like that?
Yeah, sure. And people always bring that up as the thing, right? What about armed robberies? What about rapists? Actually only 4% of the calls to the police in this country are a result of like a violent crime. And so that means that the other 96% is like stuff like domestic violence, mental health issues, interpersonal disputes, etc. They actually don't involve violence. And I think that, we're still trying to imagine what this could look like. I mean, it was really interesting. One of the things that we've been talking about lately is in the fact that in the autonomous space, right, a police-free space, we were still struggling with getting people to not respond to violence with violence, right? And I think that and I just want to say, yeah, like, so we had been there for a month, and a month later, one of the people who he was housing insecure, homeless, and he had been inflicting harm onto people. He actually did rob one woman, which prompted the people in the park to beat him up and kick him out of the camp. He actually did come back, and they had a restorative justice circle with the victim. And she felt good enough that he had taken accountability for his actions to come back. I watched him pull a knife on somebody after he came back. And it was really interesting seeing the way that people really quickly who had relationships with him and had built a rapport. And this is what we think about when we think about community, right? People who have a connection with you, have some sort of relationship, or at least know your name. People started to call his name, put their hand on his back, try to calm him, try to separate them right away, right? And so obviously that's not always the case that can happen, but I was really impressed with the fact that, people were really able to respond to this in a really calm way. I think that we all will have to figure out what our roles are in this new society, right? And I think that there certainly is a role for, some physical type of presence or force. I just don't think that it needs to be in the way that it exists now. But I feel like it's impossible to think that we would continue life because people would always try to, have brute force over one another. We need to have some sort of line of defense for somebody. But I think that we could figure that out. 4% of the calls of this country, we can figure out the 4%. Let's figure out the 96% first.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Bianca. And just so that everyone is aware, Bianca will also be joining our Sunday afternoon session on BLM, Building the Movement. So please do make sure you register for that. The link will be posted in the Facebook page comments now as well. Thank you so much, Bianca. So next we have Deej Malik-Johnson. Deej is a socialist organizer in Manchester who's been involved in the student left and the anti-racist activism for over 2 decades now, holding various officer positions in Manchester Students' Union and the NUS. Deej has a background in mental health and will be discussing the criminalisation of Black mental health and the danger of police involvement in the institution. So over to you, Deej, and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. Before I begin, I feel that it's important to acknowledge that the pertinence of this day to talk on the subject at hand, given that it is the 12th anniversary of the death in custody of Sean Rigg, a Black man who suffered from schizophrenia, who died of what can be, in the lightest way possible, be described as severe neglect. I hope you all will join me in sending our love and solidarity to his sister Marcia, who continues to fight for justice on his behalf. I'd also like to clarify that if in my talk I use the terms BAME or BME, that I'm quoting from documents and they're not terms that I would use myself. So to begin, the Royal College of Psychiatry stated in 2018 that as the college has previously publicly recognised, patients in the NHS may experience racism and racial discrimination. This has been recognised as a problem in international healthcare systems. It can lead to substantial disparity in access to and experiences of various areas of psychiatric care, including crisis care, admissions, detentions, pathways to care, readmission, and the use of seclusion. For an example, the 2014 Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey showed that although Black British adults had the highest mean score for severity of mental health systems, they were the least likely to receive treatment for mental illness. Where they do come into contact with services, it's disproportionately based on a detention order requiring them to stay in a hospital. As a former social care professional, I can attest to this. There is a clear disparity between what we're told is an inherent problem in Black communities on one side, i.e. the rates of severe mental illness, especially schizophrenia, and on the other, the scarcity of Black people entering early intervention services, counselling and preventative care. To unpick the puzzle, I think we must tease out some of the factors briefly. Firstly, and I'm going to be as blunt as possible here, because there is a lot of coded language around this subject. I think there is a question that, are Black people naturally more mad than white people? I really don't think so, and there is no evidence to believe so. So you might ask, what may account for the higher instances of diagnosis? I think there's a number of factors, but poverty and cramped living conditions cross-culturally is a major factor in mental illness. As we know, Black Britons are more likely to live in poorer socioeconomic conditions. We're also more likely to be stopped, searched, followed and mistreated by both the state and in our daily lives. And therefore, it is not an altogether paranoid or delusional route to the belief that one is surveilled or held to different standards with an oppressive and sometimes deadly consequences. Then we have the cultural incompetency in a lot of mental health services. The overwhelming number of mental health professionals, counsellors and psychologists and psychiatrists are white and middle class, and are even with the best of intentions often misunderstand, misinterpret and medicalise the words and actions of cultural norms of ethnic minority communities. For example, the belief in jinns on one's shoulders, talking to God, a belief in witchcraft and magic could all be classed as an evidence of mental illness or of a Black person being religious, depending on your perspective. Lack of services. While we know that since 2010, austerity measures have cut services across the board, councils in working class communities simply can't afford the services necessary for their citizens, and specific Black mental health services have been particularly hit. Prior to then, there were more than 300 BAME mental health services funded in England and Wales. At my last count, there was a dozen. And the, shall we say, suspected belief that sectioning and forced hospitalisation can be and is used as imprisonment without trial by any other means. There's the inherent racism in the teaching of psychology, while simultaneously the promotion of so-called race blindness, neutrality and balance, which has served to both reinforce the ideas of Black inferiority, danger and unreliability to attest to our own reality, while simultaneously ignoring and overriding arguments about the dynamics of knowledge reproduction and production, in an example of the type of colonial gaslighting all too common in academia in general. There's the justified mistrust of state agencies in our communities and the belief that there is a problem in the service user rather than the service. I'll always remember my time working in one drug service in Greater Manchester. On one side, there was the probation service, and on the other, there was an office with a near permanent police presence. Of course, the lack of engagement of service users was a complete mystery. Another example from my time in the field was when a manager stated to me in all credulity that there were no Black drug users in Tameside, based on the opinion on the fact that there were no clients registered in services, despite obvious evidence to the contrary. This resulted in an attitude of no problem and therefore no work to be done. And all this is not to mention the experiences of Black people in educational settings or in medical settings where we are all too easily pigeonholed as a problem. So now let's talk about the issue of policing in particular. We know that since 1990, there's been over 1,700 deaths following encounters with the police. 60% of these are Black individuals and disproportionately of individuals with mental health issues. It's not much of an exaggeration, therefore, to say that encountering the criminal justice system whilst Black and with a mental health condition can be perceived as a death sentence in and of itself. Simultaneously, whilst we know that it's true, more so than ever, police officers are being asked to take the role of the first responders in a number of situations they are completely unqualified for. Their training teaches them to interact with the unknown as a potential threat, and the solution to all too often is a show of force or a deprivation of freedoms. Whilst a social worker or a mental health professional, for example, could see a man behaving erratically as someone requiring help. The fates of Rashan Charles, Sean Rigg, Roger Sylvester, Joy Gardner, Cynthia Jarrett, to name just a few, tell this tale. In 2017, the Angioloni, I can never say that name, review of deaths in police custody concluded that improvements were needed in the investigations into deaths, as well as greater care for vulnerable individuals across all ethnic groups. However, this was particularly true in relation to race and mental health issues. The stereotyping of young Black men as dangerous, violent, and volatile is a long-standing trope that is ingrained in the minds of many in our society. People with mental health needs also face the stereotype of the mentally ill as being mad, bad, and dangerous, says the review. In Inquest, a charity which focuses on police and prison deaths, said that because of this, Black people with mental health problems faced double discrimination by police. It's also suggested that investigations needed to explore whether discrimination played a factor in the deaths of Black and minority ethnic individuals more often. The report says that deaths in custody are part of a broader issue for minority reports. Deaths of people of BAME communities, in particular young Black men, resonate with the Black community's experience of systemic racism, it concludes. So, Senny's law, passed in 2018, is a new law following the death by brutalization of 11 police officers of Senny Lewis, a 23-year-old university graduate. It was introduced by Steve Reed MP, aimed at ending the use of excessive force against mental health patients, an issue that had led to a number of deaths, it said. The Labour MP for Croydon North introduced Senny's law to the House of Commons in July 2017, and it passed into legislation on the 1st of November 2018. The bill, officially known as the Mental Health Unit Use of Force Bill, requires hospitals to publish data on and when physical force is used and improve oversight and training so that staff are aware of the risks of unconscious bias against minority groups, such as young Black men with mental ill health. While this is undoubtedly a step coming from a good place, we must not kid ourselves into believing that it's a panacea. It is not the answer, it is not the solutions. It is my belief that there must be a total separation of police powers and the realm of mental health and mental illness. And in the name of Sarah Reid and so many others of our siblings, I call for the complete and radical overhaul of mental health services, mental health incarceration, housing, policing, and of prisons, as well as the decolonisation of the education system. And that's what I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deej. I mean, you covered so much in that, and I think there's so much for us to sort of take away as well. And I guess, I suppose, to sort of start off with, in terms of, you know, really going into this a bit more. I mean, right now, when we look at the mainstream narratives, if you like, on mental health, and, you know, mainstream narratives on crime, you know, some crimes are really explained away, depending on the individual and depending on their background, because of mental health. And in other situations, mental health is not discussed at all. And to really kind of, to really bring about change in cultures, and to try and, you know, make people understand the issues of mental health, and to really understand that in terms of criminality, what do you think really does need to happen in this country?
I think there is no easy solution, but I think one of the things which we need to talk about is when it comes to crime and mental illness and mental health, there is, like you say, often this narrative of a mentally ill person does this, whilst we know that the facts are that as a mentally ill person, you are far more likely to be a victim of crime than you are to be a perpetrator. I think that there is a dehumanization when it comes to people with mental ill health, and the lack of the cognition that they are vulnerable people. It sickens me a lot of the time when a lot of the time the sympathy for the mentally ill in the media, for example, is often only really brought out when it comes to a white terrorist committing a horrible act. And then that is a person who had a mental illness, who needs support, needs a bit of compassion, needs understanding. Whilst I do believe that all mentally ill people, well, all humans in our society need compassion and understanding, that isn't brought out more generally. And I think there is a racialized element to it. I think that dangerous black man, dangerous immigrant, dangerous Muslim with a mental health problem, that feeds a narrative that is quite pervasive and quite dangerous, but it sticks, you know. Whilst I think that there is like I said, the talking about people as vulnerable isn't really there. I do think that there needs to be education. I think there also needs to be a general changing of the way that we talk about these things, and it does. I think a lot of it takes, honestly, politicians as well being quite brave in the way that we talk about this. There has also been a thing where we have had these rolling back mental health services all around the country, which have left people particularly vulnerable. We have like the horrible system of universal credit, which has left people, especially people with underlying mental health issues, particularly vulnerable and isolated. How do we address that? I'd like to say with the Labour government, but I think that I think it's a much bigger issue, and I think it's something which we need to, as a society, generally have a look about ourselves, and start imagining people more complexly, and looking with compassion. I think it's the demonization of people with mental health issues has been a problem for centuries. I hope we can fix it, but I think that it takes. I think it's going to take a lot more clever people than me to solve that one.
Thank you so much, Deej. And one of the other things that I sort of think about is really about, you know, how the experiences of racism and discrimination can actually result in mental health issues, but then people are criminalized for it, and then the state, has a hard hand approach to it and believes, as you say, that it is somehow the result or the product of somebody's ethnicity, and how that further contributes to people's experiences of racism and discrimination. We do have to move on, but thank you so much, Deej, and I look forward to sort of seeing your work in the future as well. So next we have Bell Ribeiro-Addy. Bell is the current MP for Streatham, having been first elected in the 2019 general election. Like myself, Bell is currently the co-chair of the Socialist Campaign Group of MPs and is the former Shadow Minister for Immigration. Before being elected to office, Bell worked as Diane Abbott's Chief of Staff, working to end the hostile environment. Bell and Diane both continue to work to fight racist immigration policy together. So over to you, Bell.
Thank you, Apsana, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I wanted to talk a bit about policing within our immigration system. It's not often seen as a form of policing, but I think it's very important, given the powers that these private companies mostly are given, that we look at it that way. Now, I remember first becoming involved in activism because of a fellow student of mine at university called Victor Rutter. We were running the African Caribbean Society together, and one day I got a call from him, having not heard from him for a couple of days, to say that he had been taken by immigration officers for the crime, apparently, of working 4 hours over the time that is allowed when you're an international student. Now, their first attempt to deport him failed because he wasn't allowed on the plane. They hadn't allowed him to wash for a few days, and the air hostesses wouldn't allow him on the plane. So G4S guards took him off the plane into a tunnel at Gatwick Airport and gave him a very good beating. They beat him up so badly, his face was swollen for weeks. And he was eventually deported from the country. But during this time, when we tried to challenge what happened to him at the hands of the G4S guards, we met a number of difficulties because they said they were a private company, so it's very difficult to challenge them in the same way that we would police. Now, we all know that attempting to challenge the police for brutality is as difficult as it is, so imagine attempting to challenge these particular guards. Now, Victor told me about the conditions in Brook House, where he was eventually, and then a decade later I got to witness the conditions in our immigration centres for myself when I visited Yarswood Immigration Detention Centre with Diane Abbott MP when she was the Shadow Home Secretary. Now, we've been to a lot of places together, and throughout my work with her, I've seen many things, including some of the really heartbreaking situations in refugee camps across the world. But I've always managed to maintain my composure. When I got to Yarswood Immigration Detention Centre, seeing what I see there, I actually cried. Now, this is not because any one situation is worse than another, but some of the things that we've seen in other places where there have been major incidents such as war and famine, and there have been absolute causes for what has happened. You understand why people may be in the situation they're in, even though it is still heartbreaking. But in places like Yarswood, it's just pure greed and inhumanity, because you hear tales, and they're well reported in the press, and there have been exposés on them where guards, but beating people, physically and verbally abusing them, and even incidences of sexual assault. And then to find out that over 50% of the people in immigration detention are actually eventually released and given a legal right to remain in the UK. This means that in this country, we literally imprison people indefinitely for profit and not for the reason that we're stating. And it may not be against the law, but it's absolutely criminal. And there's no basis on which I think we can pass the buck to these private companies, which is what we often do, passing the buck wholesale. But if you're given a contract by the government to carry out a function of the government, which in this case is to police the immigration system, you're an emanation of the state and should be under its control, and so should be bound by its rules. But it continues with what they're allowed to do. I mean, how many more complaints of abuse and mistreatment and deaths in custody, such as Jimmy Mabenga and Christine Case? All of these cases continue to happen, and there is little action, and there's just as much inaction with any other case within within a death in police custody, but we have to recognize that when we talk about deaths in police custody, it doesn't just happen within a police station, or, you know, when someone is stopped and searched and they have their incidents such as George Floyd, and any other cases. Also what happens in immigration detention centers, those are deaths in custody. And you think about all of these things and you think, if it wasn't enough that we should be looking at this situation humanely, why don't we look at the finances of it? And, you know, some of these companies have actually defrauded the government. Their CEOs have been charged with defrauding the government. G4S and Serco charged the government millions of pounds extra for electronic tagging, and they were found to have overcharged the government with millions of pounds. When we think of all the things that we're told that we do not have money for, and, you know, despite all of this, their contracts to run immigration detention centres are renewed, and they were even awarded a 90 million contract to provide an emergency contact centre for vulnerable people during the pandemic. But if there's one thing that the pandemic has helped us to prove, is that actually we don't need immigration detention centres. We don't need immigration detention. Unfortunately, we were unable to pass legislation recently, even though it had support from both sides of the House, to limit immigration detention to 28 days. And that would have been something, because we're probably the only country in Europe that it detains people indefinitely. But we don't need immigration detention centres. As people were being removed to stop the threat of COVID, which is more likely to spread in a place like a detention centre or a prison, we're finding that very few people left. And even with those people that are left over, they realised what it was looking at. So they enforced keeping them there, even though it was unsafe, because to remove all of them would show just how unnecessary locking people up in this way is. They are perfectly able, if they find some particular need to keep track of people. And that's a model that I believe we need to move to in terms of immigration, a community model. If somebody is, for example, you know, going through a claim, at the moment the Home Office is completely incompetent, so this is causing a range of issues. If they're going through a claim and you're looking at something in particular, an asylum claim, why can't you just ask them to check in with you? As they do, so many people are eventually taken to immigration centres when they're going to do their 2 weekly check-in with the Home Office. Even though they are abiding by the Home Office rules and coming to see them, when they ask, they are grabbed and sometimes put in detention centres for months, only to be released. Now we need to challenge the system in every possible way that we can, because literally for every day they keep people locked up for no good reason, they are making millions and millions of pounds overall for a situation which does not need to happen. There are other ways, if you feel that because somebody has entered this country that you need to find them, that you can. And immigration detention is the absolute most inhumane way to continue, especially when it's done at the hands of people that police it in such a brutal way. And I think about all of the money they're giving. They're even giving money to house migrants that come in the country. That specific companies given the money to house migrants, and the housing that they give them is the most disgusting housing. And they continue to be given millions of pounds rather than perhaps giving it to local authority, who actually ends up having to deal with their integration into local areas. And they don't think about how things could work better if they were working with the people from the very beginning, if they were building housing in a way that benefits all the community. Instead, they just keep funneling money into these private companies. And when you look into who the shareholders of these companies are, you understand why it's come about this situation. So we need to end immigration detention. We need to end the way in which we police it. It's absolutely not necessary. A community model with caseworkers, should it be needed, is the way in which we should do it. And actually the Home Office should be able to handle any sort of claims that it has in an efficient way. It's not hard. It's just a complete level of incompetence of this government and an attempt to maintain the hostile environment. I also want to touch on the increase of policing of school children. Now, many of us may have some little people in our lives and know that when kids are young, you'll see them, they'll watch their Paw Patrol and any other, those programs. They want to be police officers because in those programs, the police officers are always good people and they always catch the bad guys, and that's always great. And I even think of a friend of mine who was talking to me about his daughter wants to be a detective, and turning to me and saying, well, you know, I'm sure that idea will end soon. And you think about yourself, what happens between the time when young people see police as their helpers or their heroes, and eventually see them as their oppressors. And between that time, and it's becoming earlier and earlier, people far too often witness what police do to people that look like them, members of their community on the street, and more so, you see police officers stopping young Black boys in particular in school uniform on their way home from school. It's something that I know that's happened to my own nephew, and I remember feeling so you know, so horrible when he said to me, when I said, well, you know, what happened? And he was just explaining what happened, and the police were talking to him, and I said, well, you know, does this happen all the time? And he was like, it's just what it is, as if that's something that he should become used to, as if that's a way in which you know, he will continue to live his life. And unfortunately, as a young Black man, that is what happens. But that should not be the case. And I think to myself, you know, we have a generation of young people coming up who don't see the police as their protectors. They're not seeing them as their protectors. They're seeing them as their oppressors, and just how dangerous that is, and how it doesn't work. This whole idea that we're meant to police by consent has completely gone out the window. But you know, you think to yourself, and you know, people say, well, you know, they do help us at particular points in time, and you know, you hear people talking about, oh, you know, the police are really working on the issue of race. They've got all these new things in place. But actually, more recently, I've heard some very disgusting and disgraceful remarks from Cressida Dick, who was saying, you know, Black people are often the victims of crime. We have to remember that. But you know, they're often in areas where you know, they're more likely to commit crime. So essentially saying that being Black is, you know, being a Black person living in a particular area, you are more likely to commit crime. This is, you know, our lead officer in London, where more young Black men in particular are stopped and searched than in any other city in the country. Now, if that's what the view is at the very, very top, I think to myself, what can we expect from our officers, and what can we expect from those that are meant to be? So if they've got this idea in their head that in this area, if you are Black, you are most likely to have committed a crime. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so against things such as Section 60. I think it's an absolute disgrace. It takes us right back to the SUS laws. And I think to myself, this idea, trying to pin it on what happens in the criminal justice system, is just so ridiculous. And I think to myself, in the city where, you know, they are taking drugs all through, and drugs is a good example. There is no evidence of more drug usage in the Black community than in the white community. But Black people are more likely to receive convictions and actually be stopped and searched for drugs. Now, we know that a number of people in the Labour, the Labour leadership, sorry, the Conservative leadership contest, including Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, admitted to taking drugs. Now, if the police stopped more people like them, perhaps they would find higher crimes in the white community. If you know, as long as drug convictions and being stopped for drugs continue like that, but they don't. If you continue to stop Black people and police them in the way that you do, yes, you may find, and you know, the criminal justice system is the way it is, yes, you may find there are more Black people in prison, but that does not mean that we have a predisposition to crime, and anybody that will say such a thing has no place being the police commissioner for London. And quite frankly, somebody who says something like that should resign. It's absolutely disgraceful, and I hope to see her going soon. But thank you very much for listening to me. I'm looking forward to hearing everybody else speak.
Thank you so much, Belle, and that was really insightful. And I think to relearn from you and your experience of immigration policy, which you've worked on for a number of years in Parliament. We have one brief question, conscious of time, but one question that came in from David, and you spoke about Cressida Dick, you spoke a bit about, you know, sort of people in leadership positions in the police. We have in our party, we have a few Labour police and crime commissioners. What role do you think they can play, and what should they do? Or do you think we should get rid of them altogether?
Well, I mean, the police and crime commissioners, whilst they exist, they can play a crucial role in terms of taking the lead. Like I said, if you've got somebody like Cressida Dick saying those things, if that's what it is at the top, you know, that's going to filter through. And I think the police and crime commissioners can definitely take a lead in terms of you know, looking at how police behave towards Black people. And I suppose it's not just about diversity training, because it seems that loads of people go on diversity training, leave, watch their 20-minute video or whatever it's meant to be, and come out and do exactly the same thing. It's got to be an entire institutional change. And if police and crime commissioners can start that in their own area, that definitely makes a difference. However, ultimately, I don't think we need police and crime commissioners.
Thank you so much, Meryl. Thank you so much for your time. Next, we have Maurice McLeod. Maurice is a local councillor in Wandsworth. He is a lifelong anti-racist campaigner, and as well as being a social commentator writing in The Guardian, The Voice and The Spectator, he is the vice chair of policy research think tank Race on the Agenda. And Maurice is going to be speaking a little bit about defunding the police in the community and his activism on these issues. So over to you, Maurice. Thank you.
Hello there, everybody. I'll try and be quite quick, to be honest, because I kind of imagine that you know, it's 8 o'clock in the evening and people are tired and they've been staring at a screen all day. The whole defund the police message, I think we've got a challenge. I think we've got a bit of a problem in that I think within our circles, I'd say, within the circles of people that have either had, you know, fairly negative experiences with the police or have been studying this sort of thing or are just aware, it makes perfect sense. It doesn't surprise me that certain parts even of our movement just seem as if they can't get their head around the concept of it. So I've been thinking about this. As yes, I'm a local councillor, but I've also been a journalist for a very, very long time. I used to work on The Voice back in the 90s when we were talking about Paul Condon at the time and his appalling record on race police. Sometimes it feels like we haven't really, you know, the names have changed. I've sort of been glad that the previous speakers have paid homage to some of the many Black and brown people who have lost their lives in police custody over here. As Deej said, today is the 12th anniversary of Sean Riggs' death after you know, in Brixton police station. So these things, I find it quite tiring. I find it quite like, oh, I can't believe we're still this. And there's another name, there's another person, another one of my brothers or sisters has been taken, and we sort of we pay attention for a bit, and then it feels like things move on. I mean, I grew up on South London council estates. I still live on one now, and between the ages of sort of, you know, 12 and 25. Mainly in the younger part of that age, I was stopped about 100 times, and it just became so the norm. You know, that my very first, I think was it Bell earlier who was saying, when does the idea in people's heads go from the police being there for them to being something else? And it was them. It was at those times. Before that, there wasn't much coverage of sort of police brutality or that sort of thing on telly. So ideas of the police were kind of, yeah, they're the good guys who stop crime. Then suddenly when you hit 12, which apparently makes me a fully grown man in the eyes of some, and I've never been a big person. I'm not big now, so I can't see how I could have been big at 12. Just suddenly the whole, you know, you become really, really, really aware that you are seen as, at the very least, someone to be suspicious of, at the very least. I think it's, like, as a lot of people, I guess a lot of Black people say, or Black or Asian people say, when that it's only later in life that they realise that anything was even strange. It's only when I sort of got to university and spoke to sort of woke white mates, and just realised how different my experience was to theirs. So when we talk about defunding the police, and to me it seems like a really obvious, you know, abolishing the police, it seems like a really obvious direction that society should go. And it doesn't surprise me, I suppose, that that other people just simply don't get it because their experience is completely different. I mean, you know, for me, if someone asked me the other day, when would you call the police, or when have you? I'm a counsellor. I'm a local counsellor. I work with police down in Battersea, and the ones I work with on a personal level are great. They're community minded. They say and think the right things. But definitely my experience growing up means that, you know, I was with a partner who was white, and we were in town, and I was lost, and she's like, oh, there's a policeman. And the idea that I would actually go up to a policeman and ask, you know, that they would serve me in some way just seemed ridiculous to me. But like I say, I've not had, when they were stopping and searching me, it wasn't done with any aggression. It was often done with a bit of a, sorry, we're doing this again, it's our job, you know, and they shake you down and they hope to find some drugs. I mean, I had stuff like police making monkey noises and whatever, but that was a rarity. That was like a van on Oxford Street sort of pulled over, and I looked up and they all started, you know, doing the ooh, ooh, ooh thing. That was, and that was such a rare occasion. It actually made me go, oh God, that's a change. It's not sort of one-off individual bits of racism. They're sort of doing it in a gang. Now, I mean, obviously the defund the police argument that I find I can get some leeway in, I can get people to actually pay attention to, is when we start talking about all the myriad of extra things that the police are asked to do. And even the police themselves seem to understand that they shouldn't be, doing the mental health servicing, the social work. There's police officers, you know, moving homeless people around the place, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think sensible cops that I speak to realise that that's got nothing to do with them, and they're actually quite ill-equipped to do that sort of work, which is why we end up with, the stuff that Deej was talking about when the first time someone comes into contact with the mental health services, it's by being grabbed off the street or sectioned or whatever come into contact with the police. It's no wonder they do that so badly. Of course they're not equipped to do that. That's nothing like what they're trained for. So I'm not gonna, like I say, I know that we've been talking for a long time, so I'm not gonna drown you in loads of conversation other than to say, I suppose if the only tool you have for handling a society is the police, then every single problem looks like a crime. So you know, if we can't be, I have to say, we on the left, if we're not bold enough, we're never going to be bold enough to talk about defunding the police and abolishing the police if we can't even talk about decriminalising drugs, which feels like an argument that was 10, 15 years ago, and a lot of the rest of the world has sort of realised where we're at, and it's still something that we don't seem to even really talk about. And the massive impact, obviously, that decriminalisation has on black communities in particular. Stop and search, 22,000 black people stopped since the start of this pandemic. 22,000. 80% of those had done nothing wrong. Amongst that 20%, 15% were found with a small amount of drugs, small amount of marijuana. I mean, if we don't see that, and 60% of the stops, the reason that people were stopped was the police say they smelt marijuana. So if you take away that massive tool for discrimination, that will help a lot. But if we can't even have that conversation, then it doesn't surprise me, to be honest, that this sort of conversation we're having here, unfortunately, stays locked within groups like this, where we all get it. And you go outside and you talk to anyone else, and they're totally baffled, I think, by the arguments, because sadly we as a society haven't been making them strongly enough, and that's not a very positive way to end. I am positive. I do think that things are moving forward. I just think, yeah, okay. So stuff's happened that I have been shocked by. Some of the stuff that's happened in America has been like, wow, oh gosh. And some of the conversations have been surprising. We as a party need to be a lot braver about some of the things that we're saying some of the ways that we address these issues. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere, I'm afraid.
Thank you so much, and that was really insightful, and also to sort of just see, you know, your sort of experiences at a local level, because I think it's really important on international level, national level, but not also to forget at a local level and what that really means for local constituencies and local councils. And I know that you're doing work in this area and will continue to do so. I'm conscious of time, but I know that you've got to go. But I do think that on this note really as you as our speaker, I think for the audience watching, I think it is to really maybe go away and also look at what your councils are doing, especially in light of Black Lives Matter, for example. I mean, I know my local council is now looking at doing a race equality commission to really review what they've done to date, and what more can be done. And I hope it's not just another exercise, a tick box exercise, which doesn't have sort of meaningful change and commitments. But we have seen, the statues being taken down. We have seen, things being discussed in terms of renaming institutions, which is very symbolic. But we also know that we need to really see the structural change through local councils as well. So I'd like to now invite our next speaker, who is none other than Asad Rehman. Asad is the Executive Director for War on Want and has over 35 years of experience campaigning on social, economic, climate and racial justice issues. So over to you, Asad.
Sorry, thank you, Apsana, and thank you for the kind invitation to join you. I mean, lots of speakers have said some amazing things, and thinking back to, my first involvement, first in the Asian youth movements in the 70s, and then with New Monitoring Project. So much of the discussion, the debate around defunding police, whilst the term might very well be a more modern term, but the issues have been relevant for decades. So when Bianca talked about this as being an issue that was first brought to the forefront by the Panthers, it was similarly brought here in the UK. If you look at the struggles of the Black community, and I say Black is a political term of people of colour, you see that campaign, and that one of the key demands are always being around policing and about police accountability. The debates that we had in the 70s and 80s about public order policing, policing by consent, about taking on the debates that people used to tell us, oh, well, you're really just talking about one rotten apple. And we'd say, no, it's not about the apple. It's actually about the barrel. That's what this issue is about. And the countless campaigns we had, from deaths in custody to racist murders, that culminated in the Lawrence inquiry, which focused and recognised the institutional racism of first of the Metropolitan Police, that talked about it as an institution. So it wasn't just simply about the police individually. It wasn't about individuals' racist behaviour. It was about the very notion and the role that the Metropolitan Police played within the Black community. So there's a lot that I'd love to talk about in terms of that, but I wanted to just maybe pull back a little bit and think about it more in a global context. Because I think when we talk about a world without police, really we're talking about a world without militarized borders, and we start to talk about a world which is very, very different, because it's a world that departs from the idea that the solution is incarceration or the incarcerated state. It's a world that moves away from the violence of the state and of the violence of global institutions. And therefore, this conversation, as Maurice said, it has to be part of a much bigger conversation. It has to be part of our broader vision and political demands. Because if it's left as, oh, this is something that, that is just a view of, people working around policing or in the Black community, it's not. And the reason why I say this now more than ever, when we're in a moment of multiple crises, when you look around the world, you look at the legacy of neoliberal inequality, half the world living with less than $5 a day, billions of people without food and access to food, energy. You see the climate crisis of killer floods, droughts, the forced displacement of people, the violence that we see, 4 environmental and land defenders killed each week by the state or by paramilitaries in support of the state or big business. When we look at just even of COVID and the reality of how it exposed racial and social inequalities, the destitution in the global south, the lack of health services, but also what happened in terms of the displacement of migrant workers, left destitute, people walking thousands of kilometers. And then, of course, that might amplify the existing violence of war and conflict in which we're part of. And so when I think about the world without police, I think we're talking about a world that rejects the violence of our systems and the violence of the economic model as well. And we have to tell a story, and it's important for us to tell that story, which talks about this violence of the state that goes all the way back to slavery and colonialism and imperialism. When we talk about the policing today, you can draw a direct arc, and I'm sure Imani and other speakers will probably do this in terms of when we talk about, you know, how policing was developed and the role of policing, and not just in the US where we talk about, well, you know, if you talk about slavery and the prison gangs, or you talk about, you know, the role that the police played today and how they played it in terms of slave catchers, etc., and the rules and the laws that were codified, and how the state then viewed people and viewed minority people and viewed who the people they deemed as being, you know, threats to the dominant economic model, and how policing has always gone hand in hand with this role of protecting what they see as the dominant economic system. But we here in the UK should be talking about how, you know, that the model of policing and the violence that we've seen through colonialism. You look at what happened in Australia to the Aboriginal people, or in Kenya to the prison camps, or in Palestine, in Malaysia. The policing that we saw, the militarized policing that we saw, the repression of communities and of people, many of those, of course, the laws which are still used by the repressive regimes in those countries, who use the British mandated laws, who use the laws of colonialism, still in terms of to buttress their police state. I think it's really important, therefore, when we talk about this, we put it into that wider context. But it's not something about just the past. I mean, I know in the last few months, the world has been upended. But if you remember, just thinking about, and January seems so far away now, it's such a long time ago. But remember January, we saw the protests in Chile, right? Hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets of Chile saying, this is not about 30, the slogan, this is not about 30 cents, it's about 30 years, talking about, the struggle was about the economic model, talking about militarized policing. But also remember that there were protests taking place in Algeria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, all around the world, where people were talking about economic inequality, but also talking about state violence and policing and militarization. And they didn't separate those two. They understood that the violence that they were feeling from economic inequality, from hunger, was also linked to the violence of the state and the violence of repression of that when they protested. And I think there's a lot of lessons for us to try and connect these important stories, because I don't think we can dismantle neoliberalism without also dismantling the violence of the state. It's not possible, because they are so threaded together. They're an intricate part and parcel of this world that we've created. And of course, we have to unthread this Arundhati Roy talks about it, you know, we have to unthread a thousand knitting loops of this model, of course, but policing is not something that's simply an abstract one or way down. I think it's a very, very essential part of not only challenging the system now, but also articulating our vision for the future. And, you know, I'm reminded when you look at the Black Lives Matter protests in the US today, you remind you how much of Tahrir Square, right, of the Arab Spring, where people again, you know, were connecting violent repression of the state with also a vision of a different Egypt or a different US. And I think there's a lot for us to be very, very hopeful for. I know I've not got much time, but I wanted to just maybe specifically talk about one way in which we can bring this conversation to a much wider audience. If you look back, there's you know, we all know that the climate crisis, right? We're headed towards, we're already, the violence of climate change is here. We know we're in decade zero. We're going to we are likely to breach the 1.5 degree guardrail. We're heading to at least 2.5 degrees warming. This will mean massive devastation in terms of around the global south. But there was something that's really striking when you look at who's talking about climate crisis. And there was a 2003 Pentagon report, and it talked about this scenario of climate change and its implications for US national security. And one of its recommendations was borders will need to be strengthened around the country to hold back unwanted, starving immigrants from the Caribbean, from Mexico and South America. And of course, within 5 years, the US had declared climate a national security threat. And already we saw the doubling of the budget for border patrols and border controls. And if you remember, if you're as old as I, remembering, Reagan saying to Gorbachev about the Berlin Wall, the wall must fall. Well, actually, since that very moment, what we've seen is we've seen a massive extension of walls and borders around the world. And that's not just in, Israel's apartheid wall. If you look at how India, you look at the authoritarian right and how they're building walls and fences. You look at the borders of Europe, not just of its borders that it's pushed into the Maghreb, but the borders that are being built around Eastern and Central Europe. This narrative is so much part parcel now of this. And of course it's connected to, everything from the military industrial complex that's being built up around it, from the prison camps, the apparatus to expel people, the technology that we're seeing with thermal imagery, and how that's also played domestically, right? The face recognition technology that we're seeing here is being piloted and was first tested where? It's been tested in these militarized places. It's no mistake that Elbit system, that are based here in the UK, are part of the Israeli military industrial complex that were responsible for the technologies around the apartheid world, and now we've been exporting that same technology all around the world and saying it's been battle tested. It's been tested in the most, what they call the most hostile border that exists in the world. And that's, I think, really important, because when we're talking about borders, the borders actually aren't going to be between nation states. I mean, I think that's the reality. We all recognize those with a passport, those with money are traveling, capital is traveling, the elites are traveling. The borders are about your class and your race. And I think unless we start to make the connection between issues around policing and defunding the police to a much broader vision about borders and the globalized response and the militarized policing that goes hand in hand with it, I think we're going to fail, not only in terms of losing this particular argument, but losing also to the much bigger argument that the far right are putting forward, that the solutions to all of the world's problems, from the climate crisis to inequality, social upheaval, is more militarized policing, is more borders and control, is more repressive policing that is needed to maintain security and law and order. It's no accident that Trump is now playing the law and order card alongside, in terms of and playing the race card simultaneously. That's not nothing new from Trump. If you look at what Le Pen did in France, or you look at what the far right are doing across Europe, they are combining these two things. And for people from progressive movements, for socialists, for people of color, we have to have a counter narrative and a way of connecting this story to a much bigger story. Because if we don't, then we're going to get the likes of Priti Patel, who are going to be saying the answer to migrants crossing the channel is to send in the warships. And we already know, if you look back at Greece early in the year, which shot dead migrants, right, refugees, and no uproar. Now we are willing to turn a blind eye to migrants drowning in the Mediterranean. We push back ships. That is, I think, just a start of the reality of what the next few years are going to bring, unless we win this most fundamental of issues, which is what is the role of the police and the state and security within the vision that we have of the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asad. That was so insightful, and you covered so much there, which we definitely want to unpack. But I know that you do have to head off to another meeting. But one thing I did want to sort of say is, myself in Parliament, Bell in Parliament, one of the things that we are continuously exposed to is that layer of that class difference and how that really operates even in the parliamentary environment. So one of the things that I was sort of thinking about was how we have, for example, the lack of transparency, if you like, on lobbying, for example, and how a lot of these companies and corporate organizations sort of mentioned, the wars and battles are not going to be necessarily between countries, but are going to be, perhaps between organizations. And we can see how at that level, so much is operating between organizations, and that separation of powers, if you like, being so blurred. And we look at, what's happening with COVID-19, we look at the suppliers for PPE and the various controversies that are really sort of exposing how the class differences really show themselves in our country and also across the world. I'm very conscious of time, so I think it'd be very important to maybe go on to our next speaker, who is none other than Hajera Begum. Hajera is an anti-racist activist who organises with Abolitionist Futures. She was elected full-time BME officer at UCL and mobilised the student movement on a number of issues, from prevent to deaths in custody, from free education to Palestine. So waiting patiently there, Hajera. Love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Apsana, and thank you to the team for inviting me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Brilliant. So yeah, as you said, I work organise with Abolitionist Futures, and actually just yesterday on our website, abolitionistfutures.com, we released some really cool resources created by activists in the UK, specifically on defunding the police. So I know that's a topic that came up quite a few times, so if anyone's interested, please do go over there and check that out, and I'll post a link in the comments as well. So yeah, today I'll be focusing on prevent and its relevance to the struggle of abolition. For many of us, the high point of the latest uprisings in America has been the proposal by the Minneapolis City Council, which is a city in which George Floyd was murdered, and they committed to disband the police force back in June. And while this represented an important advance for the struggle against police, and we heard from speakers around that earlier, and is a testament for sure to the long-term work of organisers on the ground there, the wording of the proposal immediately raised some concerns and suspicion. From the start, the proposal was framed around the idea of community-led alternatives to the police force, which can very easily blur into the idea of community policing. And here in Britain, we have a concrete experience of what that may look like and the damage that it can do in the form of prevent. So for those of you who don't know, just very brief background, prevent was publicly introduced as policy by the Blair government in 2006 as one strand of Labour's counterterrorism policy contest. Counterterrorism surveillance of Muslims in Britain in the early years of the millennium was militarised in the strongest sense, from heavy-handed policing, raids, arrests and detention. In the early 2000s, we saw a number of very public incidents of police violence during counterterrorism operations, such as in 2005, the murder of Jean-Charles de Menezes at Stockwell's tube station, and the raid and shooting of a Muslim family in Forest Gate in London. And not to mention, of course, the disappearance of many British citizens into the dungeons of Guantanamo Bay and Bagram, all of which provoked a visceral response and backlash from impacted communities. The development and proliferation of the Prevent programme was an alternative to this, and you can almost say it's a reform in some ways, relying less on overt policing and more on so-called community responses to terror and extremism, by which effectively amounted to communities spying on one another and other spheres of the public sector being brought into the scope of policing. Prevent sought to tackle so-called radicalisation among Muslims, which in itself was really loosely defined as an ideological process rather than anything to do with violence per se. So if you look at the examples of the signs that they use to identify someone who might be a radical and extremist, examples include a desire for political and moral change, a feeling of grievance and injustice, or even more insidiously, having mental health issues. And we've heard about the impact of that from Deej earlier on. The core concepts of radicalization and extremism use elastic definitions, which can and have been stretched by various governments to target more political ideologies. In 2015, Prevent was placed as a statutory basis for public bodies under the Counterterrorism and Security Act 2015, and that cemented it into what was previously a voluntary policy into a legal obligation. And since then, we've seen hundreds and thousands of frontline staff. We're talking about teachers, lecturers, GPs, cleaning staff, social workers, and more, being trained up to spot the radical and refer them to Prevent. Referral rates themselves have shot up to about 7,600 formal referrals a year. And the sad thing is consistently over half of them have been young people under the age of 20. And in recent years, the target for Prevent has widened, no longer just focusing on Muslims, but increasingly moving towards environmental justice groups like Extinction Rebellion, far right, and sections of the left, particularly anti-war activists. But while referrals are an important measure of Prevent's impact, the stats fail to capture the qualitative impact of Prevent, which cannot be overstated for the working class Muslim communities that have been at the sharp end of this for 14 years. Prevent and the constant expansion of counterterrorism has instilled a sense of permanent anxiety and distrust, fundamentally twisted the relationships between those in charge with protecting people into one of mutual suspicion, and robbed some of the poorest communities in the country of the ability to self-organize against their own oppression. On its own terms, as a mechanism to prevent violence, Prevent has failed. Indeed, most of the attacks in recent years were carried out by people who had gone through or engaged with Prevent. But as a mechanism to break the back of political self-organization, Prevent has somewhat been more successful. Whereas Amos were previously organizing prisoners' solidarity letter writing sessions and speaking out against global injustices, they now cannot even have discussions on topics such as the things we're talking about today, for fear of having the police or council apply pressures or threats on them. And a very similar process is being attempted in our universities. So why is Prevent even relevant when we talk about policing? So Prevent and counterterrorism matter because they show us the future of policing as a whole, as well as some of the pitfalls we can expect when organizing towards abolition. Prevent is positioned as a community-based counterpart to more overt, hard policing, hard-term policing, specifically around counterterrorism. Community policing in the context of Prevent has not diminished the scope of policing at all. It has in fact expanded it vastly, and as I said earlier, it's co-opted a massive amount of public sector, the welfare state and civil society into the work of surveillance. So in effect, community policing is actually a contradiction of the term, and it's not a building of community, but it's actually just community policing each other. For this reason, campaigning for a world without police cannot focus merely on the form of policing, and that is to say just focusing on the figures of the police officer or a force, but it must also focus on policing as a set of relations that is designed to uphold capitalist notions of law and order, to defend private property, which I'm sure Imani will talk about later, and as in the case of Prevent, stave off any challenge to Britain's foreign policy motivations. All too often, Prevent and counterterrorism are marginalized in discussions around policing and left politics. They're either compartmentalized as niche Muslim issues or thought as too difficult or messy to engage with, a bridge too far away. But the struggle against Prevent is deeply integrated into the wider struggle for the left horizon and for justice in the broadest sense of the word. And so everyone, Muslims or otherwise, has a stake in its abolition. The struggle against Prevent is the struggle against austerity, because underfunding of social services and the expansion of tainted Prevent funding are two sides of the same coin. The struggle against Prevent is a struggle for democracy, because the policies of repression and state censorship practiced on the exceptionally minority always becomes a norm before long. And the struggle against Prevent is a struggle against state racism, from racist policing to the hostile environment, to the long history of surveilling Black and brown folks in this country. And we heard many examples of this today. It is for this reason that we cannot accept the claim that Prevent is necessary for dealing with the far-right threat, because I would not trust this government and its policing agencies with tackling fascists any more than I would trust an arsonist to tackle a forest fire. Prevent undermines the very sense of community and solidarity, and that is vital for any left project to succeed. So we have to be firm in holding our position. Prevent does not need to be reviewed or reformed, it needs to be abolished. The question about what a post-Prevent society looks like is one that we have to have collectively, but we cannot begin on the terms set by our government or presume that the existence of programs like Prevent must take place. Rather than asking about how to stop so-called extremism, we should be asking how to build healthy societies free from surveillance. For anyone who wants to find out more, because I'm just really conscious of time, we've already gone over, there's a really great report done by Cage called Beyond Prevent, a real alternative to securitized policies. And that goes into more detail with a step-by-step plan into how they see that kind of a roadway to a world without Prevent. So yeah, thank you, Apsana. Hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Hajera. That was really, really informative. One thing that I was sort of thinking about was actually what you were just about to sort of touch upon, which is, what are the alternatives? What are the alternative ways of maybe policing, or this prevent duty and this prevent strategy, which, as you sort of say, is supposed to sort of deal with extremism, but as we can see through so many examples that really sort of targets particular groups such as Muslims. What are the alternative ways in which policing can be done, and those threats of extremism, whether that is far right extremism, for example, can be effectively dealt with?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely a question that comes up when we're thinking abolition in many ways, not just for extremism. But for me, I think I'd look at it from what is the root of the violence, and abolitionist theory has a really interesting way of looking at what crime is, because what we define as crime is in itself inherently political. It was touched upon before, and I can come round to it. Like, for example, smoking weed is illegal, but many other, like cigarettes, are not illegal, for example. So it's all political. What is a crime and what is not a crime? And abolitionists think of it as when is harm done, and that's, I think, a bit more of a useful way of looking at things. And then when you look at it in that way, you can look at what was the root cause of that violence. So when you come back to far right, the rise of the far right, you can't look at the rise of the far right without thinking about austerity, like the whole breakdown of like the safety net that we're meant to have in this country. And none of those things are solved by just talking to someone or just assuming they're going to do a crime and like putting them through a de-radicalization process. And we've seen it doesn't work. What I think we need to do is look to build a society, a healthy society up. We need to start restoring some of our social services, strengthen the welfare state. And that will probably help to alleviate some of these blaming that the far right do, like, oh, I haven't got any food on my table, who's taking this food off? It's the immigrations, not immigration, it's the immigrants. So it's like this kind of cycle doesn't get stopped by things like prevent, and what we have to do instead is kind of build a more healthier society. And surveilling one another just breaks down society even further, and it doesn't help alleviate anything.
Thank you so much. And I think you just sort of really highlighted the way in which those sort of narratives are really kind of embedded in that prevent strategy, and how that then means that those communities are marginalized and perceived very negatively, but that suspicion and the way in which actions are sort of and steps are sort of undertaken based on perceptions, based on suspicion, based on threats that are not necessarily material or tangible in any form, but based on sort of assumptions about people. Thank you so much for your time as well. And we'll now move on to our final guest speaker, who is Imani Robinson. Imani is a London-based interdisciplinary writer, curator, artist, plant lover, and abolitionist. They are one half of the artistic and curational duo Languid Hands, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and the editor of Talking Drugs, an online platform dedicated to providing unique news and analysis on drug policy, harm reduction, and related issues around the world. Imani is a facilitator with Abolitionist Futures and Black Abolitionist on Instagram. So over to you, Imani.
Hi, thank you. Okay, well, first of all, just thank you to everybody who's spoken. I think it's been a really comprehensive event, and it's really exciting that these conversations are possible now, because not so long ago, Asad was talking about, Remember January, and these conversations were not necessarily available or possible then. I'm going to speak a little bit about abolition and the prison industrial complex and sort of carceral logics, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about traditional reforms and how we really need to kind of get beyond traditional reforms, but really what the problems are with traditional reforms. So I'll try to be quick. Okay, so abolition is our only pathway to safety, carceral logics and the prison industrial complex. The prison industrial complex can be understood that seeks to punish behaviors and activities that threaten its own continuation and expansion. Through its reach and impact, writes US-based organizational organization Critical Resistance, the PIC helps to maintain the authority of people who get their power through racial, economic, and other privileges. There are many ways this power is collected and maintained through the PIC, including creating mass media images that keep alive stereotypes of people of color, poor people, queer people, immigrants, youth, and other oppressed communities as criminal, delinquent, or deviant. The PIC itself produces wealth, or rather maintains the inequalities that allow for capitalist accumulation to persist through the forced inactivity of people in cages and the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, understood as racism. Carceral logics requires us to believe that in order to create safe communities, we need policing, prisons, surveillance, punishment. In other words, the criminal justice system is constructed as an essential framework for how we understand what harm is and how to respond to it. But the criminal justice system does not tackle the root causes of harm. Instead, it sanctifies crime as a metric from which to gauge the morality and goodness of people, because the lives and behaviors of good people respect the authority of the state and commit to its continuation. Bad people, conversely, threaten the continuation of the state with their actions, beliefs, and behaviors. Instead of developing the tools and the language to be able to resolve conflict and understand the root causes of harm, we give such a capacity away to something outside of ourselves. We look to carceral logics to determine how and when individual people will be punished, out of our hands. This is a problem because our relationship to the state precipitates a collective and learned helplessness, for which the antidote is a focused and international intentional commitment to collective power, mutual aid, community care, tools for resilience, the deep and difficult work of conflict resolution, healing, and finding more sustainable and effective ways to respond to harm when it does occur. But so focused is punitive justice and carceral logics on punishing the individual for breaking a rule, so ill-equipped to address the root causes of harm, that our capacity to think and understand harm as collective rather than individual is deeply compromised. Collective power is not possible within logics that frame collective social issues as solely individual problems. Carceral logics undermine our capacity to develop strong, empathic relationships with each other and to practice the hard work of conflict resolution in our everyday lives, alienating us from our own experiences and understanding of harm and our capacity to both cause and heal from it. This moral framework that is based on protecting wealth, ideal notions of humanity, and unchecked institutional state control over people and behaviors produces a set of crimes instead of harms, and enforces punishment for those crimes as the correct and only way to respond to such behaviors. Instead of addressing harm itself, punitive justice and the logics of carcerality that make such a framing of justice possible responds with punishment when somebody has broken a rule, as opposed to responding when harm occurs, the common sense notion of carceral safety. The PIC, or the Prison Industrial Complex, has been set up to define harm in particular ways that protect some interests like property and racial capital and abandon others, right? So now I'm going to speak a little bit about the inadequacy of liberal reforms, because we've had many reforms, right? And yet we're still, as many of the speakers have spoken about, we're still in this kind of, in this bind, in this dynamic, in this situation. So understanding liberal reforms as wholly inadequate in moving us closer to abolition helps us to see the value or the futility of our demands. When we are able to locate such reforms within a strategy of carceral or police humanitarianism, to use a term from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, we are better able to recognize when our efforts for reform are doing more harm than good. Carceral and police humanitarianism can be understood as identifying and attending to the relatively innocent victims of too much policing in prison, sometimes formerly incarcerated people, sometimes their families, sometimes their neighborhoods, rather than advocating for a more radical rejection of carcerality and punishment itself. Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes, police humanitarianism targets vulnerable people with goods and services that in fact everybody needs, especially everybody who is poor. But the door opens only by way of collaboration with the very practices that sustain carceral geographies, thereby undermining and destroying so many lives across generations in the first place. So traditional reforms can thus be articulated as demands that necessitate collaboration with the very practices that sustain carceral geographies. Such reforms are immediately dangerous for some of us and wholly inadequate for all of us. So in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, just for clarity, as you've said, I work in drug policy. I'm the editor of Talking Drugs, and I also work for Release as the communication strategist. So in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, many drug policy activists and organizations supported calls for the urgent decarceration of prisons and other places of detention to stop the spread of the virus and therefore protect life both within and outside of the prison. But whilst abolitionist organizers were demanding the release of all people in prison by any means necessary to protect life, the loudest echo from the drug policy community was an appeal to the lowest common denominator, innocence. Fervent demands were made to release specific prisoners who were incarcerated for non-violent, low-level possession offenses, never mind that offense type has no relation to the relative health of the person in prison. The drug policy landscape did not, on the whole, support abolitionist calls to free them all for public health, instead reiterating its own obsession with the relative innocence of people who use drugs. Demanding decarceration for those who shouldn't be there in the first place only serves to justify that there are some people who should be there. Further, despite the notion that we have to be conservative in our political demands in order to be taken seriously, and prison despite the notion that we have to be conservative in our political demands in order to be taken seriously, as Harm Reduction International's research into the impact for calls for decarceration and prison decongestion on global prison populations exemplifies, the strategy of asking for as little as we deem sensible is not a strategy that works. COVID-related diversion or decarceration schemes reduced the global prison population by less than 6% as of the 24th of June, 2020. Further, stopping short of advocating for all people in prison obfuscates the deeply entrenched racism that exists in relation to the slippery categories of violent and non-violent. Or as Micah Herskind has written, whereas calling for the incarceration of non-violent drug offenders is recognized as racist, the incarceration of violent offenders has been near universally accepted as objective. After all, the crime was violent. Despite the myth that racial disparities exist only because of enforcement of low-level, non-violent drug offenses, we see similar racial disparities in offenses categorized as violent as we do non-violent. Even still, many of those who are willing to use racial disparities for drug offenses as evidence of racism are unwilling to do the same for those convicted of violent offenses. What might have occurred in the midst of global pandemics and insurrections if our collective international demand was abolition and abolition now? When people are looking for the relative innocence line, Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore writes, in order to show how sad it is that the relatively innocent are being subjected to the forces of state organized violence as though they were criminals, they are missing something that they could see. It isn't that hard. They could be asking whether people who have been criminalized should be subjected to the forces of organized state violence. They could ask if we need organized violence at all. When we try to reform drug policy without focusing on the broader contexts of violence within which drug policies are situated, organized social abandonment, austerity, interpersonal harm, and state-sanctioned organized violence of policing, prisons, and surveillance, we do so without a political commitment to resisting punitive justice in all of its forms. And that is harmful for all of us. The danger of traditional reforms is that we have sought to change or amend the rules or improve the technologies of punishment that punitive justice has in its cavalry. Traditional reforms, those that fall within police or carceral humanitarianism, ultimately have not served to transform or change in any way, really, our collective relationship to harm, nor our learned obsession with punishment. Perhaps in the same way that the war on drugs is not primarily about the substances themselves, punitive justice is not about creating safe communities. Whereas carcerality thrives in the violent absences of state-organized abandonment and carceral violence, abolition has been thought as a courageous presence. What the world, and I quote, what the world will become already exists in fragments and pieces, experiments and possibilities. So those who feel in their gut deep anxiety that abolition means knock it all down, scorch the earth and start something new, let that go. Abolition is building the future from the present in all of the ways that we can. And that was, again, Professor Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And I just want to talk just briefly about the resource that was just spoken about on abolitionistfutures.com. It's abolitionistfutures/defund-the-police. And basically how it frames and understands and decides the futility or the power of our reforms is by asking some of these questions in relation to the police. So does it reduce funding to the police? Does it challenge the notion that police create safety? Does it reduce the powers, the tools, the tactics, the technologies that the police have? And does it overall reduce the scale of policing? And you know, this resource is an adaptation of a resource that was put together by Critical Resistance in the US, but it's really adapting it to a kind of UK understanding of policing and the policies that we understand as people living here in the UK. And so some of the examples of reformist reforms or traditional reforms or liberal reforms are the best use of stop and search scheme, community policing, more training, new surveillance technologies, body cameras, hate crime legislation, diversion programs. So all of these are reformist reforms. You know, they do not limit the capacity and the scope of policing, nor of the prison industrial complex, nor of the kind of broader carceral continuum that we've spoken about throughout this panel. But there are some non-reformist reforms. There are some abolitionist steps that we can take that will, you know, that need to account for and attend to kind of party politics, or at least the policy landscapes that we exist within, right? So what are non-reformist reforms or abolitionist steps that we could take right now? Okay, so withdrawing lethal tools and tactics from the police, so tasers, pepper spray, spit hoods, and firearms. Scrapping policing programs that target specific communities, like the prevent programs, like the gangs matrix. Scrapping, reducing, rejecting extensions of police power. Someone earlier spoke about Section 16 stop and search, and we also have to talk about the coronavirus bill. Establishing firewalls between data collected and held by essential services and the police. So we already spoke about that in relation to immigration, but this is a really kind of clear, hardline reform that we can take today. Repealing laws that criminalize survival, for example, drug laws, sex work laws, migration laws, vagrancy laws, all of these laws criminalize survival, and it's kind of loops back to this idea of getting to the root cause of the harm, right? These people are trying to survive capitalism. Scrap the use of pre-criminalizing orders, so criminal behavior orders, knife crime prevention orders, those kinds of things. And then the final one that we've kind of put together as a kind of collaborative suggestion for reforms that can be taken right now is to prioritize spending on community health, education, and affordable housing. And I'd just like to end here by also saying, you know, some people have spoken a little bit about co-option and you know, a lot of the time when we talk about defunding the police and redistributing those funds, we have to kind of recognize that it's not just about moving money from one place to another, but it's also about rejecting carcerality in every way, in everywhere that it is, right? So yes, the mental health services should be should be funded, right? Should be supported. Money should go from policing to things like mental health, homelessness, domestic violence, all of which police are, within their remit to respond to. But it doesn't. There's no evidence that that's a good call on the part of anybody. And so really also thinking about making sure that we really pull out at its very core, at its very root, carcerality when it takes place in psychiatric violence throughout the mental health system. And, really thinking about where our money goes and taking it away from the obvious purveyors of punishment, surveillance and carcerality, but also into all of the areas of our life and our existence and our personal relationships, and really thinking about alternatives that don't force us to really lean into this learned or forced helplessness, and actually face and begin to develop the skills and the cultural, fluency to be able to recognize harm in ourselves and others, and really bring about a new world.
Thank you so much, Imani. I think there was so much in there to take away, and certainly I know many watching, and certainly myself, will definitely come back to hear this again, and I'm sure take reference points that you have mentioned. And on that note, the link to Abolitionist Futures that you've mentioned will be posted in the comments for those that are watching. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, and I know that there were some on the Facebook page. So thank you so much, Imani. We've also posted the link to Hajera's article, which inspired parts of the conference. And so as we now draw to a close for this evening's opening rally, I just wanted to sort of say another huge thank you to all of our speakers for their contributions and insight today. What a fantastic way to start the program of activities over the weekend. We of course have a number of other sessions over the next 2 days, everything from sessions on knowing your rights, to building Black and Brown trade union power, to Black Trans Lives Matter, to strategies to fight against state racism. Details are available on the LARAF Facebook page, and a link to register through Eventbrite is also available at stopstateviolence.eventbrite.co.uk. And when you register, you will receive a copy of the program as well as a link to join the individual sessions. Thank you so much for joining us all tonight. Keep up to date with the latest following both Socialists of Colour and LARAF on Facebook and Twitter. The links are in the chat and on your screens now. Thank you, everyone. Good evening.